Forgive me if this is a naive question, but how on earth do you prepare for that?
Good question. We've been very lucky. My mother was the Queen for a very long time. And although you kind of know that this might happen, you don't really think about it very much. Not least of all because the monarchy is about continuity. But I think for my brother, this is something he's been waiting for.
The weekly coordination meeting was supposed to be 40 minutes of routine administration. Schedules confirmed, engagements aligned, the quiet operational rhythm of an institution that had run on precision and discretion for generations. But in one silent instant, Anne read the document placed before her, and the meeting ceased to matter. What she was looking at was not a scheduling error. It was not an administrative oversight. It was evidence of something that had been constructed deliberately, sustained carefully, and hidden inside the palace's most trusted operational structures. It was a betrayal, and it had been happening for a very long time. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. To understand the full weight of what Anne discovered that morning, it is necessary to understand what royal duty actually means inside the palace. Not in the public sense. The engagements, the appearances, the ceremonial obligations that fill official calendars and generate the photographs that reach the outside world, but in the internal sense, the administrative sense. The sense that governs how the institution actually functions beneath the surface of everything it shows. Royal duty, inside the palace, is a system. It is a carefully constructed network of assigned responsibilities, designated authorities, and coordinated operations that determines who does what, who represents what, and who carries the crown's institutional weight into which rooms on behalf of which causes. Patronages are assigned through a process that considers compatibility, history, and the long-term relationship between the royal household and the organizations it chooses to associate itself with publicly. Engagements are coordinated across the household to ensure that the family's collective presence projects coherence rather than competition. Charitable associations are managed with the particular care that attaches to relationships built not in weeks, but in decades. Relationships where the palace's credibility is pledged alongside its name. This system functions because the people operating within it trust that everyone else is operating within it honestly. That when a coordination decision is made, it reflects the genuine institutional calculus the process is designed to produce. That when a duty is assigned or reassigned, the assignment has gone through the channels that give it legitimacy. That when the palace's name and resources and visible authority are directed toward a particular purpose, that direction has been sanctioned by the people whose role it is to sanction such things. Anne had built her professional life inside that trust. She had given it, received it, and defended it across more decades of royal service than most people inside the institution could remember. She understood, with the bone-deep certainty that only long experience can produce, that institutions without internal integrity were not institutions at all. They were facades. And facades, however impressive their surface, could not bear the weight the monarchy was required to bear. That was why what she found in the document did not simply make her angry. It shook something foundational. The specific, quiet devastation of someone whose most reliable operating assumptions had just been confronted by evidence she could not dismiss, minimize, or explain away. She read it a second time, then a third. Then she asked the aide who had brought it to leave the room, close the door, and ensure that no one entered until she called. The door closed. Anne sat alone with what she knew. The document had been compiled by a member of the household coordination staff, a woman whose role placed her at the intersection of scheduling, administrative records, and the operational logs that tracked how royal duties were assigned, fulfilled, and reported back into the system. It was not a role that attracted attention. Coordination staff were the invisible machinery of royal operations, the people who ensured that the visible surface of the institution functioned smoothly by managing the unglamorous architecture beneath it. But unglamorous architecture, in institutions built on process and record, was where the most durable truths lived, because process created documentation. And documentation, when examined by someone who understood what they were looking at, told stories that the people who had generated it had been confident would never be read in the way it was now being read. The woman who had compiled the document had spent months watching something that troubled her before she decided what to do about it. She had watched it first with the uncertainty that attaches to partial information, registering anomalies without yet having the full picture that would convert those anomalies from interesting irregularities into a coherent pattern. She had watched it second with the growing discomfort of someone who was assembling that picture against her will, finding connections she would have preferred not to find. and she had watched it third with the particular heaviness of someone who had arrived at a conclusion she could not responsibly keep to herself and was working out who, within the institutional structure around her, was the right person to bring it to. She had brought it to Anne through 3 intermediaries, each of whom had understood the sensitivity of what they were carrying and had handled it accordingly. The chain of transmission had been careful, discreet, and structured to protect the woman at its origin, to ensure that whatever happened with the information she had compiled, the fact of her having compiled it did not reach the people whose conduct it documented. What the document described, when read in its entirety and in the sequence the compiler had assembled it, was a pattern of interference, systematic, sustained, and deliberately structured to avoid the kind of institutional visibility that would have triggered oversight. Engagements that had been formally assigned within one area of royal responsibility had been quietly redirected. The redirections had been processed through informal verbal instructions rather than written requests, which meant they had left no standard administrative trail. Patronages with established institutional histories had been managed in ways that gradually shifted their public attribution without the consultation that such shifts required. Charitable relationships that represented years of careful palace investment had been rerouted through channels that changed who they were publicly associated with. And in several cases, the resources of the royal household, its communications infrastructure, its logistical capacity, its public-facing authority, had been deployed in support of activities that had not been sanctioned through the formal processes that were supposed to govern such deployments. No single instance, in isolation, would have produced a clear picture. The pattern had been constructed with sufficient granularity that each individual element retained plausible deniability. It was only when the full timeline was laid out and the connecting thread was followed across all its iterations that the picture resolved into something unmistakable. The connecting thread, consistent across every instance the document covered, led back to the same point of origin. Instructions delivered verbally, never in writing, passed through intermediaries who had been given just enough context to execute them without being given enough context to understand their cumulative significance. The instructions had come from within Camilla's office. Anne did not move immediately. Movement without preparation, in situations of this magnitude, produced responses that could be challenged, undermined, or dismissed on grounds that had nothing to do with the substance of what was being responded to. She had seen enough institutional conflicts across enough decades to understand that the architecture of a response was as important as its content. A response built on procedural solidity could withstand challenge. A response built on urgency alone could be dismantled by the first person with the patience to find its structural weaknesses. She spent the morning in the document. She cross-referenced its timeline against her own institutional memory. The meetings she had attended, the coordination decisions she had observed, the moments that had seemed slightly irregular without her having sufficient context to understand why. Against the full backdrop the document provided, those moments resolved. They stopped being irregular and started being explicable. And their explanation was the same in every case. She called Sophie at midday. Sophie arrived within the hour, read the document without interruption, and delivered her assessment with the directness Anne had come to rely on across years of working alongside her in the palace's most sensitive spaces. Sophie said she saw 3 things. She saw a deliberate effort to expand the operational footprint of one part of the royal household at the direct expense of the coordination structures that were supposed to ensure the whole functioned with integrity. She saw a methodology specifically designed to avoid the consultation processes that would have either sanctioned or blocked each individual action if those processes had been engaged. And she saw a pattern whose continued operation would produce increasingly visible institutional damage as its scope expanded, which the trajectory the document showed made inevitable. Anne said she had arrived at the same 3 conclusions independently. Sophie asked what she was going to do. Anne said she was going to need Sophie's help with 2 conversations, and that the sequence of those conversations was going to matter as much as their content. The first conversation was with Charles. Anne did not go to Charles because she required his permission. The institutional authority she now carried was sufficient to initiate a formal response to what the document described without the monarch's prior sanction. She went to him because he was the king, because the document concerned the operation of his household, and because the relationship between them, built across a shared lifetime of obligation and mutual reliance, made informing him before acting not a procedural requirement but a personal one. He was her brother. He deserved to know before the action, not after it. She brought the document to him in the first window of his morning that his private secretary could clear. She placed it on the desk without preamble, in the way she placed all difficult things before him, directly, without softening the approach in ways that might distort his first response to the material. She waited while he read. She watched the quality of his attention change as the picture assembled itself for him. The slight forward movement of his posture, the stillness that replaced his initial composed expectancy, the particular look that crossed his face when confirmation of something feared arrived in documentary form. When he finished, he did not speak immediately. He looked at the document. Then he looked at Anne. He asked her one question. He asked whether she was certain. She said the documentation was extensive and cross-referenced. Certainty in matters of this kind was a function of evidence. The evidence was sufficient. He was quiet for a moment that stretched long enough to carry its own weight. Then he said he trusted her judgment completely. He said she should proceed as she considered appropriate, and he asked to be kept informed at each significant stage. Anne said she would. She picked up the document and left. The second conversation was with Camilla. Anne had considered 3 different approaches to this conversation before settling on the one she chose. She had considered formal escalation first, having the institutional response communicated through official channels before any direct personal exchange, creating a record that preceded the encounter and framed it procedurally. She had considered a mediated conversation with a constitutional advisor or senior household official present to formalize the exchange and provide an institutional witness. She had rejected both. The betrayal documented in the file was not, at its core, an institutional matter, though it had deep institutional dimensions that would require institutional responses. At its core, it was a matter of personal conduct within a shared space. And personal conduct within a shared space required a personal conversation, direct, unmediated, in the register of honesty that institutional language was specifically designed to avoid. She found Camilla in the private morning room she used on this particular day, according to the schedule Anne had reviewed before leaving her office. She entered without announcement and closed the door behind her. Camilla looked up. Her face carried the composed neutrality she maintained in unexpected situations, the product of years of practice in receiving the unexpected without betraying her interior response to it. Anne placed the document on the table between them. She did not speak while Camilla processed its presence. She did not speak while Camilla opened it. She did not speak while Camilla read enough of its contents to understand what it contained and what its presence in this room, brought here by Anne, meant. When Camilla looked up, Anne spoke. She said that what the document described was a violation of the institutional trust on which the palace's internal operations depended. She said the pattern it documented was not administrative error. She said the instructions that had originated within Camilla's office had produced outcomes that no one with the authority to sanction those outcomes had sanctioned. And she said that the accumulated effect of those outcomes had been the systematic redirection of royal duties, institutional resources, and public-facing authority toward ends that the household's formal processes had never been asked to approve, because the people directing the pattern had known, or should have known, that approval would not have been forthcoming. She said this constituted a betrayal, not of any single person, though it had affected specific people significantly, of the institution itself, of the coordinated trust that made the institution function, of every person within the household who had been operating on the assumption that the structures they relied on were operating honestly. Camilla began to respond. She reached for the language that people in difficult positions characteristically reached for. The language of intention, of context, of the gap between what had been meant and what the documentation appeared to show. She spoke with the composure and the careful articulation of someone who had spent decades operating in rooms where language mattered and every word was a choice. Anne let her speak. She gave the response its full space, listening with the complete attention she gave to all things she considered worth her time. And when Camilla finished, Anne said one thing. She said that what had been intended did not alter what had been done, that the outcomes documented in the file existed regardless of the intentions behind them, that the institutional response to those outcomes had to be calibrated to the consequences that were evidenced, not to intentions that were unverifiable, and that in her judgment, and in the judgment of the king who had been informed of the matter and had confirmed his support for an appropriate response, the consequences documented were serious enough to require a formal response. She said that effective immediately, Camilla's active engagement in the specific areas of royal duty that the document showed had been interfered with was being suspended. The suspension would remain in place for the duration of a formal review. The review would examine the full scope of what the document described, would identify any additional instances within its scope, and would determine what structural changes were required to ensure the documented pattern could not recur. She said the review would be conducted by a team whose composition had already been agreed with the king. Its findings would be reported simultaneously to Charles, to herself, and to William. And the structural changes it recommended would be implemented in full, with ongoing compliance overseen by Anne's office in the capacity that had been formally designated following the previous institutional review. Camilla received all of this in the silence of someone who had understood, before the conversation concluded, that the conversation had moved beyond the point where any response she could offer would change its outcome. She looked at Anne for a long moment. She looked at the document on the table. Then she said she understood. Anne picked up the document. She said she was glad. She left the room. William received the full account from Anne that same afternoon, delivered by telephone in the direct, complete, unembellished manner she used for all significant communications. She told him what the document contained. She told him about the conversation with Charles and the conversation with Camilla. She told him about the suspension and the review and the structural arrangements that were being put in place. She told him everything in the sequence that had occurred, without editorial framing, without shaping the information toward any particular response. When she finished, William was quiet. He asked why she had not come to him first, before acting. Anne said, because the document's primary subject was the operational integrity of the royal household, not the specific territory of Diana's collection, where William's direct involvement was not only appropriate, but necessary. The household integrity matter was territory where her own institutional authority was sufficient, and where involving William before acting would have added weight to the response without adding necessary clarity to the decision. She had informed him now, before the formal review began, because his knowledge of what was underway was something she owed him, not something she needed from him. William received the distinction. He held it for a moment in the way he held things that were both logically clear and emotionally complicated. He asked whether the review would touch on areas connected to Diana's charitable legacy. Anne said it would. Several of the redirected duties and patronages that the document described had institutional connections to Diana's charitable work, and those connections made William's direct input to the review both relevant and important. She asked whether he was prepared to provide that input. He said he was. Catherine was beside him during the call, and afterward she sat with him in the particular companionate quiet that characterized the way they processed difficult things together. She did not require him to perform a reaction. She simply remained present while he absorbed what Anne had told him, which was its own form of support and in many ways the most useful one available. When the silence had been present long enough to have done its work, she said that Anne had acted with exactly the clarity the situation required. William said he had been watching Anne act with exactly the clarity situations required for as long as he could remember. He said it had never once failed her. He said that was not coincidence and not luck. It was character. And character, unlike almost everything else inside the institution, could be trusted to remain consistent under conditions that tested everything else. Catherine said she thought that was the most important thing anyone could say about another person. William said he thought so too. The formal review was convened within 48 hours. Its terms were precise, its scope was clearly defined, and the team conducting it had been selected for two qualities above all others: competence in the specific kind of institutional analysis the document required, and discretion sufficient to work with sensitive material without creating additional institutional exposure. The Palace Communications Office was informed, in the careful language the Palace used when significant internal processes were underway, that a routine operational review was proceeding in certain areas of royal duty coordination. The framing was accurate in every factual particular and carried no more information than the situation currently required to be shared externally. Inside the palace, the circle of knowledge was kept deliberately small: the staff member who had compiled the original document, the constitutional advisor who had helped Anne understand its institutional dimensions, Sophie, Charles, William, Catherine, and the review team itself. Camilla's household received formal notification that the suspension was in place and the review was proceeding. Beyond that notification, no communication passed between Anne's office and Camilla's for the duration of the review. That silence was agreed upon by both parties and maintained with the discipline the situation required. It was not the silence of hostility or punishment. It was the silence of a process that needed protected space to function without the interference of ongoing negotiation between the parties whose conduct it was examining. The review took 12 days. When its findings were delivered, on a quiet morning in the small room whose size communicated the weight of its purpose, the picture they presented was more extensive than the original document had shown. The pattern of interference covered a broader timeline. The review had identified additional instances that the original document had not captured, instances that extended both the scope and the duration of what had occurred. The methodology had been more sophisticated than the original document's surface suggested. The verbal instruction chains had been more deliberately structured, the intermediary layers more carefully insulated from each other, the overall architecture of concealment more intentionally designed than an initial reading had revealed. And the purpose that the pattern had been serving was now clearer. The document had suggested a directional intent without fully mapping it. The review had mapped it. The redirected duties, the rerouted patronages, the reattributed charitable associations. They were not random. They were consistent. They described a sustained effort to accumulate visible public-facing authority in specific areas chosen with apparent deliberateness for their public resonance and institutional weight, in ways that the palace's formal coordination processes would never have sanctioned if asked directly. Charles received the findings with the expression of a man for whom confirmation of feared things was still painful, even when the fear had already been absorbed. William received them with the stillness he used when the full weight of something required all his available interior resources to hold. Anne had arrived at her findings 12 days earlier and spent the intervening period ensuring that the process confirming them was rigorous enough to be beyond procedural challenge. Charles asked what the structural changes would look like. Anne had prepared them in full. They were comprehensive, specific, and designed not only to address the conditions the review had identified, but to create accountability architecture robust enough to detect similar patterns before they reached the scale the review had documented. Every significant vulnerability the review had identified had a corresponding structural response. Every gap in the existing oversight framework had a proposed closure, and every closure had a named accountability. A designated person or office whose ongoing responsibility for monitoring compliance was explicit, documented, and connected to reporting lines that reached the people with authority to act on what they received. Charles accepted every proposal without amendment. Camilla received the formal communication of the review's findings and the structural changes being implemented through the King's office. The communication was precise and complete. It documented the findings in the language of institutional assessment rather than personal judgment. Factual, evidenced, and calibrated to say exactly what the evidence supported and nothing beyond it. It described the structural changes being implemented across the areas the review had examined. It confirmed the continuation of the suspension in the relevant areas until the new structures were in place and had been verified as functioning correctly. And it contained a final paragraph that Anne had drafted and Charles had approved. The paragraph stated that the conduct documented in the review had caused institutional damage that the changes being implemented were designed to repair. That the palace expected the new arrangements to be honored with the completeness that the previous arrangements had not been. That ongoing oversight of compliance had been formally assigned to the Princess Royal, and that the exercise of that oversight would be supported by the full authority of the Crown. Camilla's response was brief. She acknowledged the findings. She confirmed her understanding of the new arrangements. She stated her intention to comply with them. She said nothing else. And the palace, receiving that response, moved forward in the way that the palace moved forward when it was functioning as it should. Not waiting for emotional resolution to precede institutional action, but creating the conditions under which emotional resolution might eventually become possible while the institution continued its necessary work. The story did not reach the public in the form of an official announcement. No press conference was held. No statement was released that named the review, described the findings, or explained the suspension in terms that external audiences could fully understand. What reached the public, in the imprecise and emotionally accurate way that palace information always traveled when it escaped without official sanction, was a shape. The shape of a family that had confronted something difficult inside itself and had handled it with enough institutional seriousness to produce real change. The shape of a woman who had walked toward a problem rather than away from it, and had done so with the directness that problems of this kind required. The public did not have the details, but the public had spent decades reading the royal family through exactly these kinds of partial signals, and the reading they produced from the shape available to them was not wrong. It captured something true about what had occurred even without access to the documentation, the conversations, or the formal findings that had produced the outcome. Anne had discovered a betrayal. She had acted. The action had been complete, principled, and backed by the full weight of the institution's authority. And the institution, in the aftermath of the action, looked different than it had looked before. Not weaker, not more fragile, but more genuinely itself, more capable of being what it claimed to be. William felt the shift, not as relief, exactly. The situation that had produced the shift did not permit the clean simplicity of relief, but as something more durable. The specific, quiet steadiness that comes from knowing that the place you inhabit is being protected with the seriousness it deserves. He said to Catherine one evening, several weeks after the review's findings had been implemented and the new structures had settled into the operational rhythm of the household, that the thing he kept returning to was not any single moment in the sequence of what had happened. She asked him what he kept returning to. He said it was the image of Anne walking into that morning room and placing the document on the table. Not because of what it had set in motion, though what it had set in motion mattered enormously, but because of what it represented about who Anne was and had always been. The willingness to carry a difficult truth into the room where it needed to be received, without softening it, without waiting for someone else to decide that the moment was right, without allowing the complexity of the relationships involved to become a reason for delay. He said that quality was the rarest thing he had encountered inside the institution, more than intelligence, more than dedication, more than the ceremonial faithfulness that royal life publicly celebrated and privately depended upon. The willingness to walk toward the hardest thing and remain standing when the hardest thing pushed back. Catherine said she thought that was what people meant when they said they trusted someone. Not that they believed the person would always make the right decision, but that they believed the person would always make the honest one. William said that was exactly it. He said Anne had done that. She had made the honest decision at every point where a decision was available. She had made it without calculation, without consideration of what it would cost her personally, and without the institutional hedging that the palace so often substituted for genuine moral clarity. She had protected the palace by refusing to let the palace protect itself from the truth. And that, William said, was what royal duty actually meant. Not the ceremonies, not the carriages, not the years of accumulated public appearances that filled the official record. The willingness, when the moment required it, to walk into the hardest room, place the evidence on the table, and hold your ground until the institution found the honesty to respond to what it had been shown. Anne had done that. The palace was different because she had. And the difference, though it would never appear in any official account of the institution's history, was real and durable, and exactly the kind of change that the monarchy needed most and found hardest to make. The kind that began not with ceremony, but with one person deciding, in a quiet room on an ordinary morning, that the truth was more important than the comfort of leaving it unspoken. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.